Nobody told you the truth about the American West. The movies lied, the books left it out, and the History Channels preferred the pretty version. The real version was different. A man in the saddle for 14 hours. Sun cracking the earth beneath his feet. A tin plate with something he didn't choose, because the alternative was not eating. And not eating on the trail was the beginning of the end. The cowboys who crossed the American West between 1860 and 1880 were not heroes. They were laborers, underpaid, broken from the inside, living under conditions that today would be classified as abuse, and still they kept going, every single day, without a choice. What kept them alive was not courage. It was food. Ugly food, nameless food, food nobody should ever have to eat. These are the 20 meals history forgot. From number 20 down to number 1. Every single one has a story nobody told right. Until now. Number 20. Hardtack. The biscuit that wouldn't die before anything else. There was this. Flour, water, salt, pressed together and baked until it turned to stone. That is not an exaggeration. It was almost literally stone. It dated back to the Civil War. Soldiers called it sheet iron, worm castles, because sometimes it came with bugs inside, and the men ate it anyway. It lasted months, sometimes years, without spoiling, not because it was good, but because there was nothing in it left to spoil. The problem was eating it. Biting directly could chip a tooth, so they broke it with a rifle stock, soaked it in boiling coffee, fried it in bacon grease until it softened enough to chew. A barrel cost $2, fed a crew for weeks. It tasted like nothing. That was the point. Pure survival fuel for men 80 miles from the nearest town. Number 19. Pinto beans and salt pork. The architecture of survival. If you asked any trail cook what actually kept the crew alive, he wouldn't point to the beef, wouldn't point to the coffee. He would point to the bean sack. And he would be right. Pinto beans were light. They lasted forever dry. A 50-pound sack cost $4 in the 1870s and stretched across an entire drive. The cooks soaked them overnight. Come morning, they went into the cast iron Dutch oven with salt pork, wild onions if he had foraged any, dried chili peppers if the outfit ran a South Texas crew, hours of slow cooking until they turned into a thick, smoky paste that clung to the tin plate and sat heavy in the stomach through the long night watch. Cowboys ate beans at breakfast, at supper, cold from the pot at midnight when they came off watch. They complained about the consequences loudly and never once turned down a second helping. Number 18. Sourdough biscuits. The starter worth more than gold. The most valuable thing inside the chuck wagon was not the meat, not the coffee. It was a clay crock with a living culture inside. The sourdough starter was wild yeast kept alive with flour and water. Some cooks carried the same starter for years, drive after drive, state after state. On cold nights, the cook slept with the crock pressed against his body to keep the yeast warm, because losing the starter meant losing the one thing that made trail food bearable. Every morning before dawn, he mixed starter with flour, salt, and lard, placed the dough in the Dutch oven with coals underneath, and heaped on the lid. They came out golden, heavy, still steaming. Cowboys split them open and filled them with bacon grease or bean juice. Simple as that. And it was the best moment of the day. Number 17. Fried salt pork. The sound of one more day survived when beef was off limits. Because you don't eat the product you're being paid to deliver, salt pork was what remained. It arrived in wooden barrels, submerged in heavy brine. The cook sliced it thin, soaked the slices in water to pull some salt out, then fried them until the fat rendered and the edges crisped. The grease left in the skillet became the foundation of everything else the cook made that day. A barrel cost $8, lasted weeks. The flavor was aggressively salty, aggressively fatty. Cowboys called it Sal Belly, ate it almost every morning alongside biscuits. On a cold morning in the Texas Panhandle, frost on the grass and 1,000 longhorns stirring in the dark, that sizzle in the skillet was the sound of one more day that had begun. Number 16. Cornmeal mush, the simplest of them all. When flour ran low, the cook turned to cornmeal. A few cups stirred into boiling water with a pinch of salt. It turned into a thick porridge that could be eaten hot or poured into a pan to set overnight. Come morning, the cook sliced it and fried the pieces in bacon grease until a golden crust formed on both sides, crispy outside, soft and warm in the middle. A 25-pound bag of cornmeal cost about $1, traveled well in any weather. Trail cooks from the Deep South brought this tradition from home. It required nothing but water, fire, and a heavy pan. The simplest meal on the trail, and one of the most satisfying. Number 15. Red-eye gravy. When nothing could go to waste. When a cowboy wanted something to drown his biscuits in, red-eye gravy was the answer. The cook fried salt pork or ham in a skillet, then poured black coffee directly into the hot drippings. The mixture hissed. The coffee lifted every caramelized bit stuck to the bottom of the pan. It created a thin, dark gravy with a bitter edge and a deep, smoky pork flavor. No flour, no milk, just grease and coffee. The name came from the reddish sheen that floated on top when the fat and coffee separated. Cowboys poured it over biscuits, over mush, over anything that needed moisture. It cost nothing extra. The cook was already frying pork and brewing coffee anyway. Pure efficiency, born from a culture that could not afford to waste a single drop of anything. Number 14. Son of a gun stew. When nothing could be left behind. This one requires honesty. When an animal was slaughtered on the trail, the question was never what to keep. The question was whether anyone would be foolish enough to leave anything behind. The heart, the liver, the kidneys, the tongue, the gut, the marrow still locked inside the bones. Everything, still warm, straight into the pot. But there was one ingredient that made this stew legendary. A tube connecting two of the calf's stomachs, found only in animals still nursing, filled with a substance resembling marrow that gave the stew a richness impossible to replicate. The cook diced everything, browned it in the Dutch oven, added wild onions and water, and let it simmer for hours. Cowboys considered it a luxury because you didn't eat the cattle you were paid to deliver. But when a calf was born mid-drive and couldn't keep up, that was different. Old trail hands said you could judge a cook entirely by his son of a gun stew. Too much liver, and it turned bitter. Not enough marrow gut, and it lost its soul. If you made it this far and realized you didn't know anything about what these men actually lived through, this channel was made for you. Every week, we go deep into the history most channels don't have the courage to show. No pretty version, no myth, just what actually happened. Subscribe now, because what comes next on this list is even heavier than what you just saw. Number 13. Peach cobbler. The night the camp smelled like a bakery on special nights, after crossing a river without losing any cattle, or after reaching a town where supplies could be restocked, the cook brought out the dried peaches, soaked in water until they came back to life, sweetened with brown sugar, sometimes a splash of whiskey if someone was willing to sacrifice it. Those peaches went into the Dutch oven lined with biscuit dough, coals underneath and on the lid. 40 minutes later, the camp smelled like a bakery. The crust puffed up golden and flaky, the peaches bubbled thick and syrupy beneath it, and grown men who had spent the day choking on dust went completely silent at the first bite. Dried peaches cost about 15 cents a pound, a luxury on a trail budget. That's why cobbler was saved for occasions. A good cook knew that morale mattered as much as calories. One cobbler could keep a crew happy for a full week. Number 12. Spotted pup. When rice became a reward. Spotted pup was the cowboy version of rice pudding. The cook simmered rice until tender, then stirred in raisins or dried currants, brown sugar, and a splash of canned milk if the wagon carried any. The raisins scattered through the pale rice gave the dish its name. It looked like a spotted dog. Cowboys who spent every meal eating beans and salt pork treated spotted pup like a prize. It was sweet. It was soft. It reminded them of something their mothers might have made back home in Missouri or Tennessee. Rice traveled well. A small amount expanded dramatically when cooked, one of the most efficient staples on the wagon, and one of the most anticipated. Number 11. Bear sign. The donut that saved expeditions. The fastest way for a trail cook to become a legend was to make bear sign. Donuts fried in deep, rendered lard over an open fire. The cook mixed flour, sugar, and sourdough starter into a soft dough, rolled it out, cut it into rings, or twisted it into knots. Drop the pieces into a Dutch oven filled with shimmering hot fat. They puffed up golden and crisp in minutes. Rolled in sugar while still warm, gone from the plate before the cook could finish frying the next batch. A cook who could make bear sign had his pick of outfits. Cowboys would ride extra miles and work longer shifts for a man who fried donuts on Saturday nights. Historical records show bear sign was used before the hardest stretches, not as a reward, as preparation, because the hardest thing to manage on a 600-mile drive wasn't the cattle, wasn't the terrain. It was the moment a man's mind decided the destination wasn't worth what the journey was costing him. Bear sign pushed that moment back, sometimes by days. Number 10. Skillet cornbread, the sound that meant supper was close. The cook mixed cornmeal with a little flour, salt, baking soda, and water or buttermilk if he had it. Poured the batter into a greased skillet. Set it into the coals with the lid on. The bottom formed a thick, crunchy crust. The inside stayed moist and crumbly. It slid out of the skillet in one golden disc that the cook cut into wedges with a knife. Cowboys crumbled it into beans, sopped it through gravy, ate it plain with a drizzle of sorghum syrup. Cornmeal was cheaper than wheat flour, more available across the southern plains, and it didn't need a sourdough starter, making it the perfect backup when the yeast culture failed. The sound of cornbread sizzling in a hot skillet meant supper was close. And on the trail, that was the best news a man could hear. Number 9. Trail chili, the recipe time couldn't erase. The vaqueros brought chili up the trail, and it never left. The cook browned chunks of beef in lard, then stewed them low and slow with dried chili peppers, cumin, garlic, and oregano for hours. No tomatoes, no beans, just meat and peppers in a thick, fiery red sauce. Trail chili bore no resemblance to what comes out of a can today. It could be dried into bricks and reconstituted with water weeks later. One of the most portable meals on the entire drive. The vaqueros were the original cowboys, skilled horsemen who invented many of the tools and techniques American cowboys adopted, including this spiced meat stew, a debt history rarely acknowledges. Number 8. Dried apple pie. The one that made cowboys sing. Dried apples were a chuck wagon staple. They weighed almost nothing and lasted for months. The cook soaked them overnight until they plumped back to life, stewed them with sugar and cinnamon, then spooned the filling between layers of pastry dough in the Dutch oven, baked over coals. That pie came out bubbling and golden, and the smell it sent through the camp could stop an argument mid-sentence. A pound of dried apples cost about 12 cents in the 1870s. Made 2 full pies. Cowboys sang songs about dried apple pie, not all of them complimentary. But when that pie came out of the Dutch oven, nobody was singing complaints. Number 7. Roasted marrow bones. The luxury nobody else wanted when a steer was slaughtered. Nothing went to waste. The cook cracked the leg bones with the back of an axe, set them upright in the coals, roasted them until the marrow turned soft and buttery. Cowboys scooped out the hot marrow with a knife, spread it on biscuits, or ate it straight from the bone. Rich, almost overwhelmingly beefy, with a smooth, fatty texture that coated the tongue. Bone marrow delivered pure, concentrated calories when every man on the drive was burning thousands more than he could replace. Today, roasted marrow bones cost $15 a plate in Manhattan steakhouses. On the trail, they were the leftovers nobody else wanted. Number 6. Pan de campo. What the vaqueros taught the trailbred of the vaqueros crossed into cowboy cooking and stayed. Flour, lard, salt, baking powder, water, rolled thick and cooked in a skillet or directly on hot coals. It puffed slightly as it baked, formed a chewy bread with a charred, smoky crust. Vaquero cooks tore it into pieces to scoop beans, wrap around meat, or sop through chili. No rising time, no sourdough starter, no oven required. Pan de campo acknowledged a truth Anglo cowboys were slow to admit. Much of what made the trail kitchen work came directly from Mexican tradition. The vaqueros had been running cattle across this land for 300 years before the first American cowboy saddled a horse. Number 5. Salt pork and wild greens, medicine disguised as supper. When the trail crossed country where wild greens grew, a smart cook grabbed everything he could find. Dandelion greens, wild mustard, lamb's quarters, anything edible. threw it all into a skillet with thick slices of salt pork, cooked it down until the greens wilted into the rendered fat. Those greens delivered vitamins the trail diet desperately lacked. Cowboys eating nothing but meat, beans, and bread for weeks developed cracked lips, bleeding gums, bone-deep fatigue. A plate of greens and pork fat was medicine disguised as supper. Southern cooks knew this instinctively. On the trail, that knowledge saved lives. Number 4. Ash cake. The science. Nobody knew they were using cornmeal, water, pinch of salt, wrapped in wet leaves, wild grape leaves, or corn husks when available, buried directly in the hot ashes of the campfire. 20 minutes later, brush off the ash. You had bread, crude, gritty, tasting of smoke and earth. But something was happening in those ashes that nobody understood at the time. When corn is cooked in an alkaline environment like wood ash, a process called nixtamalization occurs. The ash breaks down the outer hull of the corn and releases niacin, a B vitamin the human body cannot extract from untreated cornmeal. Without this process, people who relied heavily on corn developed pellagra, a devastating deficiency disease. Native peoples understood this chemistry thousands of years before European scientists identified it. Cowboys making ash cake were unknowingly tapping into ancient nutritional science. The wood ash wasn't just a cooking surface, it was an ingredient. Number 3. Vinegar pie. The solution. Nobody had a name for when the chuck wagon had no fruit, no berries, nothing sweet but sugar, and a jug of apple cider vinegar. The cook made vinegar pie. It sounds terrible. It wasn't. Vinegar mixed with sugar, eggs, butter, and nutmeg created a filling that tasted remarkably like lemon custard. Poured into a pastry shell and baked in the Dutch oven, it came out golden and trembling. This recipe came from Appalachian kitchens, where lemons were impossible to find. The vinegar delivered the same acid bite that citrus would have. Cowboys who tasted it for the first time demanded to know where the cook found lemons on the open prairie. The answer got a laugh every time. Number 2. Sourdough flapjacks. The closest thing to home the trail ever offered. If biscuits were the daily bread, flapjacks were the Saturday morning reward. The cook thinned his sourdough starter with water, added sugar and baking soda, poured the batter onto a greased griddle over the coals. They cooked fast, bubbled on one side, flipped to brown on the other, stacked 4 high on a tin plate, and drizzled with sorghum syrup. They were the closest thing to home cooking a cowboy tasted for months. The sourdough gave them a tangy depth that regular pancakes couldn't match. Every cook had his own batter thickness, his own flip technique. Arguments about flapjacks lasted longer than arguments about religion. A stack at dawn with black coffee and the sound of the herd moving slowly in the distance. That was as close to peace as the trail ever got. Number 1. Steak in the coals. The meal the world forgot. When a steer broke a leg or a calf couldn't keep up, the cook had fresh beef. And when a trail cook had fresh beef, he did something no modern kitchen can replicate. He threw the steak directly into the fire, not onto a grill, not into a pan, into the coals. A thick cut laid flat on glowing red mesquite coals seared instantly, the outside charred to a black crust in under a minute, locking the juices inside. The cook pulled it out, knocked off the ash, served it almost raw in the center. The Maillard reaction, the chemical process that creates deep, complex beef flavor, happens faster and more intensely at the extreme temperatures of direct ember cooking than in any skillet or grill. Modern chefs have rediscovered this technique. They charge $50 a plate. Trail cooks did it because they didn't have a clean pan. Cowboys gathered around the fire in silence for a meal like this. No jokes, no complaints. Just knives on tin plates and the occasional grunt of satisfaction. It was the finest meal the trail ever produced, and we forgot it completely. At the end of this list, what remains is not historical curiosity. It's something else. It's the realization that these people were not special. They were not born stronger. They didn't have something we've lost. They simply had no choice. And when there is no choice, human beings find a way. They always do. With a biscuit hard as stone, with organs nobody else wanted, with a donut fried before the hardest stretch of the drive, with a vinegar pie that tasted like nothing but kept the body standing. These meals were not created to impress, they were created to work. And that is exactly why history forgot them. Because there was no glamour, only necessity, only people doing what had to be done to keep going. This channel exists to remember those people the way they deserve to be remembered. There is much more waiting.